Evening, everybody, and welcome to what is now becoming a regular feature each year. Les Hurst will chair a session like this, where significant books published during the previous year will be discussed. Over to you, Les.
Thank you very much, Quentin. Welcome everybody to this George talk about the books of 2024. We have three speakers in addition to myself. The author, DJ Taylor, Teika Marija Smits. I almost got it right, but she'll correct me later. The editor of one of the volumes in question, and Douglas Kerr, the academic and critic, who will be talking about a third volume, and I will be talking about a fourth at the end. Before we get to that point, let's go through what I know are the Orwell related books of 2024. We've seen Brian May's 1948, a prequel that came out from the Exeter University Press. An interesting work, but one which required some preparation in reading. Duncan Roberts' Orwell à Paris, I've not read because it's only been published in French, although I think the original was written in English. He's still waiting to find an English publisher for what I understand is a fascinating book about the time that Orwell spent in Paris.
Can I update you, Les?
Yes, certainly.
Yeah, he has got a publisher. The publisher has recommended changes for the English edition, which will be coming out later this year.
Okay, thank you. The Folio Society have published a limited edition with new illustrations of 1984, which got rather a lot of attention from the introduction by Elif Chirac, which was published during the year, and that introduction was also published as an article in its own right during the year. There was the large novel, Paul Theroux, who's now been writing for 30 or 40 years, Burma Sahib, which is based on Orwell's time as a police officer in Burma. We had Laura Beers, Orwell's Ghosts, Wisdom and Warnings for the 21st Century. Professor Beers actually toured and spoke about the book considerably in Britain towards the end of the year. It's a book which pays quite a lot of attention to the comparisons between Orwell's writings of the period and contemporary events. I think David Taylor actually did a co-event with Laura Beers.
No, I didn't. No.
Ah.
I read it and enjoyed it and puffed it, but I didn't do an event with her.
Okay.
Actually, no, I did an online thing. I did an online thing with a Washington Historical Society, which was very interesting last year, but not a live gig.
No. Okay. And we have DJ Taylor, who is published Who is Big Brother? A Reader's Guide to George Orwell. He'll be telling us about that in a little while. We had Ariane Banks, The Quality of Love, Twin Sisters at the Heart of the Century, about Celia and Mamaine Paget. Celia, who became a great friend of George Orwell, Mamaine Paget, who married Arthur Koestler, Orwell's friend. We have had the volume of short stories, The Utopia of Us, edited by Teika Marija Smits, which is a response to the centenary of Evgeny Zamyatin's novel We, a book which, of course, in 1945, 1946, made a big impression on George Orwell. And finally, a much smaller book, which I'm going to draw attention to because it's a lighter reading than some of the other works on the same matter, Ian Burnett, Joseph Conrad's Eastern Voyages. Towards the end of his life, as he had done several times before, George Orwell emphasized how much he appreciated the work of Joseph Conrad. And I'm just going to draw attention to one or two elements in Conrad's work that have similarities in Orwell's. So that's, as far as I know, it's quite a lot of books about Orwell, but not as many as we had in 2023. Who knows what the events of 2025 will bring us before the end of the year. But if we can go on then and take advantage of our contributors, we have David Taylor here, and his book is Who is Big Brother? A Reader's Guide to George Orwell, which is published by Yale University Press.
That's right.
Yes, the American academic publisher, who also published some quite interesting, more general works. So, David, what were your publishers looking for? Who's the intended audience?
I don't know that they were looking for anything in particular. I offered it to them and they took it. How it came about was when I finished writing Orwell: The New Life, which was published in 2023, which was an inordinately long book. I think it worked out at 230,000 words in the end, although my publisher was kind enough to say that it didn't read like a long book. But there was quite a lot of material left over. And the material that was left over was really of a kind that wasn't suitable for inclusion in a biography, because it strayed off into particular quadrants and angles, and the book was long enough already. And it began life, I suppose, as a collection of what I would call Orwell puzzles. I was always very interested in the books that the academic John Sutherland used to write about 20 years ago, where he would pick on peculiar incidents or fragments of Victorian novels which seemed to have conundra attached to them, things that couldn't be satisfactorily explained or demanded sort of greater concentration than critics had previously afforded them. And I found that there were several Orwell topics exactly like this that I wanted to write about. Things, I mean, the title is obviously one of those questions. Some of them are more light-hearted. One of them, for example, is why did Orwell have it in for pigs? You know, he's a the great fan of the animal world. Why should he have this particular porcine horror? You know, that sort of goes there. And also, I'm very interested in 1984 and technology. You know, how the technology works in the novel. It's a novel built on the idea of a surveillance society, but it seemed to me the more I reread the text that Orwell really had no idea how technology worked or the position it was supposed to play. All these things. So it began as a book of Orwell puzzles. Yale, of course, being an academic publisher, were very keen on this, but wanted to make it more of a kind of general guide, which is why it's now called A Reader's Guide to George Orwell. So it simply examines Orwell sort of kind of chronologically, but then with due regard to themes like the obvious ones, you know, empire, England, women, the kind of progress, myths and legends, Big Brother, and so it's kind of chronological, but with themes. And so I gather because you know obviously the sort of the educational remit, I think the paperback which is coming out in the summer is actually going to be called. They're going to simply reverse title and subtitle, so it will now be called A Reader's Guide to George Orwell, with the Big Brother, who is Big Brother, somewhere else in the rubric. So that's how it came about.
Yeah, I'm a great fan of those books by John Sutherland that you mentioned, as opposed to his book about Orwell, which was appalling. Um, you know, is Heathcliff a murderer? And two others, or
Mm.
they're collected in one enormous volume called The Literary Detective. Well worth reading by anyone who's interested, as Orwell said, in trivia. Um,
Well, the thing about them is they're not trivia, because sometimes he'll pick up on some tiny detail that, when you think about it, is a vast symbolical importance. I mean, for example, when his marvelous discussion of Thackeray's Vanity Fair, he looks at the picture of Lord Steyne, you know, sort of standing there on his hearth, and he's got a single tooth left in his mouth, and Sutherland deduces that this is a Waterloo tooth, you know, that he's paid money for to someone to bring from the graveyards, where a lot of dental supplies were procured in after 1815. And that, of course, is a marvelous sort of symbolic moment. So it's little things like that that he picks out.
mm. Uh, I've got a copy of this is the contents page of
Mm.
Who is BB. Um, what so would you like to draw attention to any of the chapters in more detail? What parts of Orwell's life and writings do you think need to be better known?
Well, I suppose I would have to say, having been very fortunate through the largesse benevolent stance adopted by Richard Blair, I was the first person to be allowed to have a proper look at those 30s letters, you know, the Brenda and the Eleanor ones, which we've spoken about on this format before, where it's exceptionally interesting and fill in whole sort of areas of detail from Orwell's life in the 30s. And I think Orwell's life in the 40s is pretty well documented because the friends he had then were mostly famous friends or people who then became famous, who left records of their dealings with him. He's a much easier animal to track through the thickets of 1940s literary life than he is in the 30s. And so my interest, certainly in writing Orwell the New Life, was to pay much more attention to what he got up to in the 1930s. And when you do that, you start finding not so much angles, but you find people that you didn't previously know that he'd known. I mean, the one I always instance is when there's a famous photo, well, not famous, but it's a photograph I got from Eleanor Jakes's daughter, which shows Orwell sitting on Southwell Beach in 1932 with her mother, and in the middle is this chap with a moustache. And nobody could ever tell me who it was. The Collins family didn't know. And finally, years after Orwell the Life was published, in about sort of 2010, I got a letter from a woman in New Zealand who said, "That's my father, Samuel McKechnie, who was a great friend of Orwell's in the 1930s." And Sam McKechnie, very, you know, a civil servant who wrote novels and very interesting sociological studies and books about literature. And it enabled, once I knew who Sam McKechnie was, other bits of Orwell's life then began to fit into focus. I mean, the famous where he says in his diary, or I think in a letter in the 1930s, that he'd been out to see a friend and got soaking wet and had to walk home and this kind of thing. And I discovered from this source that in fact he'd gone round to the McKechnies in North London, and so and I'm pretty sure, or I suspect, let us say, that there are lots of other people like that whose relationships with Orwell are just not known about. And I think more, you know, there is more research to be done there to fit more people into the mosaic that is his life in the 1930s.
Didn't he take the name McKechnie and give it to the bookshop
He
owner?
did, he did. Mr. McKechnie's bookshop, in which is a little private joke that you wouldn't know about unless you had discovered his, you know, his relationship with Sam, which I think must have lapsed sometime in the 1930s because there's no reference to him. Oh, and in fact, you see, there is no reference to him at all. If you look to in the index to Peter Davison's magisterial 20 volumes, there's nothing. So, but I'm convinced that there are other people like that out on the margins. I'm for example, you know, going back to his life in Southwold, which I did a lot of work on. These As you may remember, one of the finds for Orwell: The New Life was a sketchbook that somebody had compiled in Southwold in the early
Yeah.
1930s with some marvelous, with at least two people who are Orwell to the life. Now, my suspicion is that those sketches were done by Madame Tabois, you know, the artist who taught at St. Felix School and turns up in the new cache of letters from Ella and Brenda, but I can't prove it, and nobody else has been able to make this connection. But that is my suspicion, because I know that we know that Orwell's mother, Mrs. Blair, took lessons from Madame Tabois, and it seems likely that if anyone was going to sit down and sketch her son, it would be her.
Mm. Yeah, anyone who's listening to this, you and I did a great George talk when the New Life came out,
We
which must
did.
be
It was
available
great fun.
online. So I encourage everyone to go back and a view that, and then if you haven't bought it, then buy it. Orwell: The New Life. Is the Orwell: The New Life available in paperback now?
Yeah, it was out. Came out last year in paperback. Yeah.
Okay, so copies should be available at reasonable cost. Just a quick last question.
Mm.
From all your visits to the United States and talking about your work, and I'm pretty sure that you
Well,
make a
two or
visit
three,
near.
but three visits to the United States. Actually, let's
Well,
not
it seems
let's not
more.
pretend I spend my life in constant transatlantic transit, Les. But yeah,
Do you find a difference between people's interest in Orwell here and there?
it's a very interesting. That's a very interesting question in terms of the different reactions you get, because I mean, obviously Orwell has a huge fan base here in the UK, and he has, I would say, possibly an even huger one in the States. But it's a slightly tricksy one, because although what we'll call the liberal left in America admire him, obviously, but there's this huge right-wing groundswell in the States about him, and so I do endless podcasts where the American publicist will warn me in advance. You do realize, Mr. Taylor, that this organ is connected to the National Review, and I'll go, yeah, that's fine as long as I don't have to perjure myself. And does sometimes come a moment when an immensely grave and courteous American podcast host will say something like, "I take it, Mr. Taylor, that Orwell would have given those commies hell," or something, something like this. But as I say, one is never sort of forced to perjure oneself, and there's a huge level of enthusiasm out there. And of course, Orwell foresaw this, in those last letters from 1949, where he admits, or he concedes and warns, that 1984 will be used as a stick by the American right to beat the left all over the world, which is exactly what happened. So one can't really complain about these tendencies. You just have to make sure that you're not being asked to do things that you ideologically disagree with.
Okay, that's great. If I can move on then to Paul Theroux's Burma Sahib, and Douglas Kerr has written a long review of it for George Orwell Studies. Douglas himself has worked in the Far East for considerable periods. The Orwell Society Journal had a long review of Burma Sahib by Carol Biederstadt, who's also has a major experience of the Far East too. And of course, what we have here is an American writing about a Britain in the British Empire. Now, if Douglas, you've written in the novel, Paul Theroux doesn't show any awareness of the quite complex political situation. Do you think that's the principal area which is a problem in the novel, or are there others?
You mentioned 2 or 3 reviews of the book. You failed to mention Darcy Moore's review, which was very angry and listed all the things that Theroux had got wrong about the facts of Blair's life in Burma. I'm a bit more relaxed about these things. I think I don't read novels for facts, but it's true that Theroux sometimes makes a few howlers. I don't think he's very good on the general political situation in Burma, actually, but he knows Orwell's novel pretty well. So Orwell's Burmese Days, it's clearly a political novel. It has a political motive. Orwell had certain things that he wanted to say about the British in Burma to get off his chest. So it's a political novel. It's a slightly problematic political novel in that while he's highly critical, and we would say no doubt rightly critical about how the British went about things in Burma, it's a novel that doesn't give you any very heartening sense of how things might actually be different. So there's no sense that if the British cleared out tomorrow, that Burma would be very much better off. In fact, if there's a weakness, a political weakness in the novel, I would say it's that the Burmese people are rather thin. You don't see as much of them as you see as the foregrounded European people. Now then Theroux comes along 100 years later, and he's writing a political novel too, because it's about Blair in British Burma. But in a sense, also, of course, this is a historical novel, isn't it? Because of the things that he's talking about are long past. I feel that this is rather a personal novel, actually, for Theroux, that he feels a certain kinship with Orwell. He's clearly Orwell is one of his favorite literary masters. Theroux he takes as the motto for his book a quotation from Orwell where he says, "There's a short period in everyone's life where his character is fixed forever." I'm not sure that's actually true, but if it is true, then I would agree with Theroux that that moment was Orwell's time in Burma. So what he's most interested in, I think, is showing how Burma worked on Blair to make him the Orwell that we know. So the novel actually follows exactly Orwell's time in Burma. It begins, everything is seen through the eyes of the young Blair. It starts where Blair's Burma career starts, with the steamer coming through the Suez Canal, November 1922, and carrying the teenage police cadet to his first posting in the East. And there's quite a lot about his rather ominous sense of what awaits him. Because after all, he's traveling thousands of miles to a place where he knows absolutely nobody. And he's only 19 years old, and it was quite a daunting prospect. And Thoreau's book ends 5 years later with the end of Blair's time in the East, where he takes another steamer, this time going the opposite direction, and it finishes when that boat reaches the port of Marseille, and Blair disembarks, and he comes off the boat and finds himself surrounded by a local demonstration where the people in Marseille are demonstrating against the conviction of Sacco and Vanzetti in the United States. So at the end of the book, Orwell kind of disappears into this new political context. I thought that was quite neat. So I suppose this is Thoreau's way of suggesting that what awaits Blair in Europe is a future engaging in politics. I would say, however, that Thoreau is a bit wobbly about the objective political situation in Burma, as the Marxists might say. He gets the official politics wrong, and Darcy also was rendered very angry about this. When the police cadets arrive in Burma for the first time, they're welcomed by the governor, and this is a real character, a fellow called Butler. And the governor gives them a speech in which he says, oh, well, there's no point in us trying to introduce any form of democracy in Burma. The Burmese people won't understand it. They don't need it. And our job is just to sit on the place and keep law and order going and not give them a voice in the government. This is completely unbelievable because at this time, since 1922, the Chelmsford Reviews had been introduced in India, granting a level of self-government to Indian people. And the next step was to introduce them in Burma. So it's extremely improbable that the governor of Burma would have given a speech against the policy of his own government. So Thoreau's portrayal of colonial Burma is a pretty stereotyped. It's not very nuanced. It's maybe enough in order to carry the action through, but it's not very delicate.
Okay, so the question then is what is Thoreau good at? You actually ask in your review, though he may not always be very nuanced in his version of the political scene, he is as ever expert in reading a sense of place and its sensory environment.
Yeah, I would make a thing of this, actually. I think this is what Thoreau is good at. And we all remember that he started off as a travel writer, and that's how he's best known, actually, particularly writing travel narratives about Asia. And I was impressed by this level of the book. It's interesting, you recall that I think it's in Rodriguez and Peer, is it, where Orwell says, in every novel about the East, the scenery is the real subject matter.
Yeah.
And that's a curious thing for him to say. And I don't think it's actually true of Burmese days. But when it comes to scenery, Thoreau is your man. He can tell you what it's like, what things look like, what they feel like. Joseph Conrad, we'll be talking about in a moment, said, my task, which I'm trying to achieve, is to make you see. First thing you've got to do is get a sensory grip on the experience that's being provided. And I just think, and I found particularly in this book, there's a wonderful description of a train. We all know Thoreau loves trains. A train departing from a station in Burma. This is an old steam train, and the sort of clanking and whooshing and all that kind of stuff. Thoreau is an expert at this. And then I want, if you allow me, I'm just going to read a bit of scenery writing, which I thought was also pretty good. So this is the scenery as viewed from the train. They left the hot glare of the city and its risen dust, the shop signs and hoardings and the clatter of carts, the sullen faces of natives stalled at level crossings, the noses of their bullocks and horses pressed against the horizontal pipe of the barrier. They'd entered the jungle and its green shadows and its leaf-scented air, its sheltering trees, the glimpses of green fields and fences, a geometry of gigantic earthen trays. I think that's really good. A geometry of gigantic earthen trays of standing water with rice shoots poking through. His first sight of paddy fields that he'd known only from an illustration in a school book. and those pictures had not revealed the beauty of them he saw now. And this tells me that Thoreau knows what he's doing when he's talking about environment and scenery.
Yeah.
I would say that he's rather better at that than Orwell is.
And there's actually also in the Road to Wigan Pier where Orwell recalls an American missionary turning to him as a police officer and saying, I couldn't bear to have your job."
Yeah.
And Orwell says, here's this guy, basically insulting me, and on what basis? What we ought to mention is that you yourself are the author of Orwell and Empire, published
Mm.
by Oxford University Press. Fine,
Yeah.
fine work. And I also have
Thank you for mentioning
actually
that.
an excellent short essay by you on jungle in the book collected in the book Asian Crossings: Travel Writing on China, Japan, and Southeast Asia, edited by Steve Clark and Paul Smethurst.
Well, there
So,
you go. I'm the jungle man.
did you?
No, I think I should say that Thoreau has actually packed a lot of Orwell into this novel. He obviously knows Orwell pretty well.
Yeah,
Both Orwell, both the biographical Blair, and then, of course, the fictional story that he tells in his novel Burmese Days.
yeah,
So you've got what happens in a hanging, you've got what happens in shooting an elephant, you've got uh, Blair's or Orwell's or Florey's gradual feeling of disenchantment and disillusion as a colonial official, policeman, of course, in Burma. And then you've got pretty much everything, all the main points that happen in Burmese Days. And these come mostly in the last part of the novel. I get the feeling that Thoreau was perhaps running out of puff a bit. So he reached for Burmese Days and said, oh, I can put this bit in, I put this bit in, put this bit in. So the last few chapters of the novel are a kind of sort of digest of Burmese Days. Good stuff, actually. And I think that his representation of young Blair, the 19-year-old George Orwell, I find it plausible. If you can imagine what it was like, and Thoreau helps you to imagine this, to be in circumstances like that at that age. And we see the beginning of the political education of Eric Blair in the novel, and Thoreau's pretty good at that, I think.
So, I mean, would you recommend the book, or there are one or two books about Orwell which I think none of us would recommend. Would you recommend Burma Sabe?
I would. Don't tell Darcy that you like it. However, people who know Orwell well can get quite a lot of sort of minor satisfaction from ticking off the little clues that Thoreau plants all the way through the novel. For example, there's a character called Comstock, and there's another minor character called Bowling. And there's a moment in which Blair in Thoreau's novel looks at the enormous jail at Insane, Insein, and he imagines a whole society being like a jail. And of course, this is clearly a sense in which Blair's experience in Burma would cash out later in 1984. I would recommend it. Don't expect it to be absolutely faultless in its representation of the facts of Blair's life, but then that's not really what we read a novel for, is it?
Okay, excellent. Thank you very much. Now, DJ Taylor said that the 1930s wasn't so well known as the 1940s, but it was in late 45 or 46 that George Orwell first heard about Yevgeny Zamyatin's novel We, and realizing that but We itself was about 20 years old when Orwell learned about it. So that inspired the anthology, which is edited by Teika Marija Smits, who's with us now, to bring out a volume of new stories inspired by Zamyatin's We. So, Teika, as the editor of the Utopia of Us, you approached both known authors of science fiction and made an open appeal to all potential authors. Were you surprised by the responses you received and the knowledge of Zamyatin's work that you discovered?
Yes, I was. I was incredibly surprised by the response. I was greatly heartened by it because clearly this was a book that many science fiction writers had been inspired by, and they loved the book. Some were very intrigued by the book. Some of them had read the book a long time ago. Some had come to it more recently. And so what I found was that I approached a set of authors, well-known science fiction authors, and they were very, very happy to be involved, and they wanted to be involved. They said the novel meant a great deal to them. And so I waited for them to do their thing and write the stories. But in the meantime, I had an open call for any writers to be able to submit stories to me. And I felt that was the fair thing to do. And I think Zamyatin would have thought it was the fair thing to do as well. And I think we received around just under, I think about 100 stories in the end. So there was quite a great deal of breadth and diversity to the themes and the topics covered in the short stories. So then what I had to do with an editor's eye is to filter out those ones that repeated them, that clashed with some of the other ones or were repetitions. I did find that there were quite a few repeats or quite a few echoes where you would get similar characters like D503 and I330 in people's stories, and romance being a force for revolution. And I had to be quite careful to not let the anthology solely be about that. So I was trying to look at it with an eye of making the anthology interesting for readers to be on different topics, to be on different themes, and I think I achieved that. Certainly the stories are very different in tone and theme, but they obviously have Zamyatin's work and their inspiration running through them. So what I found was particularly interesting was that I tried to, there were some stories that dwelt on romantic revolution, on romantic relationships and love and romance as a force for revolution. But some of the other ones that really intrigued me were ones that where art and creativity were a force for revolution. Sometimes it was about the quality of food. There's a very interesting story about how the food in Zamyatin's We is awfully bland. It's dreadful. It's the same kind of food over and over again, and how that would actually potentially prompt people into rebellion. So I thought that was really interesting, and powerlessness and futility, boredom, they were other things that prompted some of the characters into rebellion. And the other thing that I need to keep an eye on is some of the stories wrote in the world of Zamyatin's We, and that was, I really love those, and some of the writers captured that world perfectly. Alia Whiteley's story is set in the same world, and the way that she has done that is just incredible. So, but what I wanted to do was get some other worlds in there. So some of the writers took We as an inspiration, but it set the story in their own world, and that was very interesting. So I wanted to make sure that we had some worlds that were quite fantastical, and some of the stories were set maybe more in the past, and some were far future stories, and some were set in the near future. So I wanted to have a great range and breadth of topic and theme, and I think I achieved that. So I was very pleased with what I was sent.
That's great. I mean, after the book came out, I made contact with you, and you gave us an article, partly about the background and partly about your reading of Orwell, for the Orwell Society website. I encourage everyone to go away and read it. Were you paying much attention to the influence on Orwell at the time you were bringing together all of the stories and editing, or were you more interested in bringing attention to Zamyatin today?
I think I was trying to draw more attention to Zamyatin, but obviously in articles that I've written, I've highlighted how Orwell was such a great, he was fantastic at resurrecting we, in essence, because it was an influence on him. And obviously many people have seen the parallels in plot between we and 1984. So sometimes fans of Zamyatin's work maybe are a bit prickly about Orwell's work, but some of them are very appreciative of Orwell's bringing we out into the light again. So I met with some writers were very pro Zamyatin and a little bit anti Orwell. So I had to sort of be a bit careful about that, and sort of, it's just that tricky thing where writers do find parallels, and writers do kind of, it's almost picking up on this subconscious collective, and these themes and ideas just keep cropping up. And some people say what they're doing is copying each other, but these ideas and themes just pop up and people will think of them independently. But it's almost as though there's something in a subconscious collective and people sort of picking up on a zeitgeist. So I had Orwell in the back of my mind, but what I was trying to do was to highlight Zamyatin and raise people's awareness of what Orwell did. He did a lot to make sure that Zamyatin's We was republished and it was out there again for readers to discover. So obviously I'm very grateful for that.
Yeah, the interesting thing is that Orwell had looked at other books from the past. The long essay review called Prophecies of Fascism, which had actually looked at some of the books published before the First World War. Even Zamyatin was 20 years old when he read it. But I suppose the difference is that Zamyatin was the first one which came from the Soviet experience, as opposed to these other books which had been written in the West. Do you think that shows up in any way?
Yes, I think, I'm not sure whether it was in that essay or another one of his articles, but he does certainly talk a lot about British socialism and how maybe people in British society in those days just couldn't even really conceive of what communism in Russia was like. And I would very much agree with him there. I'm actually half Russian and my mum grew up in the Soviet Union. And I think there is just something so fundamentally different, or something so different between Russia and Britain, that even though in Britain we can talk about socialism and equality, and we can imagine a world in which things are shared, everyone is on an equal footing, etc. But of course, it's we have such a different Britain has such a different historical background to Russia, in which Russia was ruled by the Tsars for so many centuries, for so many years, and so I think it's very difficult for people in Britain to understand the weight of that history in Russia, and to understand how, even though they tried to break free of the Tsars, what they had in essence was just replacing one kind of, in essence, a totalitarian state for another in communism. And I think Orwell was completely right to say that British people might not have been able to conceive of just how this had happened in Russia and the actual reality of what communism was like. And certainly that's something I picked up on with my mum, and just saying that her experiences of living in the Soviet Union was things like people just, if they spoke out against the state, they suddenly disappeared. And of course, me growing up in Britain, I had no understanding of what this meant. I said, how do they disappear? And she said, well, they just do. And you don't ask about them, because otherwise you're the next person to disappear. And I just thought that was fascinating, how I couldn't even conceive of something like this. And yet for my mum, it was completely normal. So I think Orwell got it right. And I'd imagine that we gave him a great insight into what life was like and how they were, and how Zamyatin and the way that Zamyatin was writing about this and the transition from going from the Tsarist government to the communist government. And I think that must have influenced him greatly.
Thank you. About the time the book came out, you also published some interesting comments via the British Science Fiction Association Facebook page on 1984 and psychology, where you suggested that the characters don't appear very rounded characters because they're archetypes, I think in the Jungian sense of archetype. Would you like to, since we've got you, would you, and I've never heard that idea before, but it sounds fascinating. Would you like to expand on it for a moment?
Yes, well, it's something that I'm very interested in because I'm a huge fan of Jung's ideas and theories. And it was actually an article that I wrote for my website, for my husband's website, which is called Living with Limerence, about this idea of romantic love as an obsession. And he actually investigates and discusses the neuroscience of that. And I'm also a big fan of Christopher Booker's The Seven Basic Plots, which takes a very it looks at the seven basic plots through a Jungian lens and how there are only a certain number of stories that we tell and we keep retelling. And so he very much talks about archetypes as well. And through my studies, through my own writing and storytelling and editing, I do see these plots continually cropping up. And I do see these archetypes. And Jung, obviously, with his idea of the archetypes, said that they are very useful shortcuts for us to be able to show examples of patterns of behavior, patterns of thought, the fact that certain people in our lives, they do display these characteristics. And they're very good, and that they're very good. They help our brain to make shortcuts and categorize situations or people if we are ever in a situation where we need to quickly judge something. Obviously, you could say that making snap decisions about somebody isn't always a good idea, and that's when where our brains, hopefully you can think in greater depth and reflection. But sometimes it's very useful to take in a certain situation to very quickly make a judgment about somebody. For instance, if you're in a situation where you might be frightened of somebody and you actually are suspicious of that character, of that person. And so that's your brain trying to make a shortcut about making a judgment about them. Are you in a difficult, potentially life-threatening situation? And so Jung talked about how these archetypes are shortcuts that tell us about things. And I know some readers sometimes talk about stereotypes in fiction, and that obviously they talk about stereotypes of well, both men and women in novels, but in a lot of stories, I see them being used more as archetypes. And I would say that in Zamyatin's We and Orwell's 1984, we see this hero and heroine as archetypes. And so both D503 and Winston Smith are in essence a hero, and we can see them undergoing a journey and the challenges that are placed ahead of them. Whereas I330 and Julia are, let's say, an archetype of a temptress, where they tempt the hero to go maybe forget their journey or take them on a detour or somehow challenge them. But of course, this is a dystopia that we're talking about. So the temptresses aren't actually doing anything bad. They're actually doing something very positive. And I've always argued that I particularly like I330, Zamyatin's character, because she's really clever, she's smart, and she's witty. And she's very courageous and brave. So I think she's a fantastic character. I like Julia as well, but I don't feel I know Julia as well through 1984. But what I would say there is that unwittingly, maybe both Zamyatin and Orwell were using archetypes in their stories, in essence, to get the reader to ask questions about their own lives. How would I act in that way if I were the hero in this challenging situation? What would I do? Would I fall at a hurdle? Would I be inspired to break free of this difficult situation. So I think what those archetypes are trying to do are to ask us questions of ourselves and our own psychological journeys in life. And so I think they're actually quite useful in that way. And I don't merely see them as stereotypes. So that's probably my answer about the archetypes.
That's very good. Thank you very much. I think we've come to the end of our 3 individual discussions. Can I ask the 3 of you a question before Quentin throws everything open to the floor? And this is the question. Orwell spent 5 years as a police officer, and yet he didn't write a novel in which a police officer was a principal protagonist. He spent a long period in broadcasting, and yet he doesn't write a work in which the protagonist is a broadcaster. Why did Orwell not write about these large areas in a large way? Start with you, David.
It's a very interesting question because, of course, there are obviously areas of his life where he did make use of the material, the school teaching, for example, and the bookshop, the bookseller's assistanting, and that kind of thing. So it's not as if he wasn't, and we all know, the ways in which he picked up pieces of felt experiences and then extrapolated them. I think one of the things I think is that obviously he passionately wanted to write about Burma and did, but from a different perspective. One of the arguments I suppose I'd put forward about this, those times, especially the BBC time, is that, and I know this from my own personal experience, both in the world of work and as a writer, sometimes you end up doing things professionally, which you think will give you material. And I speak as a novelist here rather than a biographer or literary critic. Sometimes you undergo professional experiences which you think will be useful for you creatively, and then you find that you're just unable to contemplate them. I mean, for example, I spent years working in the City of London, not shoveling money about, but as a corporate copywriter, and it was incredibly tedious. And one of the things I consoled myself with was that this will provide the material for fiction. And it didn't. It was too boring. It was too, and although we see Orwell using a lot of his Burma experiences and and obviously the senior, I mean, he says, doesn't he, that Burma, the thing about any Westerner who goes to Burma will just be obsessed by the scenery because it's so peculiar compared to the British experience, and in some of the metaphorical language in Burmese days is extraordinarily extravagant. It's like it's almost 90s-ish in its patternings and its so it's Rococo imaginings. But I think he wrote Burmese days to get Burma out of his system. But I think he found that although obviously he has things to say about the politics of Burma and the way it's being administered, I think he probably found that his police experience was just not easy, or in fact sometimes in some ways even necessary to put into a novel. And he was so glad, I think, to get out of the BBC and so anxious to get set work on get set down to Animal Farm. There's that letter to his agent Leonard Moore, written about 3 days afterwards, saying, you'll be glad to know I am writing a novel again. I think he was so pleased to get to work on Animal Farm that he sort of, the BBC disappeared from his consciousness, only to reappear in fragments to provide some of the institutional background to 1984. So that would be my explanation. I'd be interested to hear what the others have to say.
Douglas?
Yeah, I'd agree with David. I think that for him the BBC was the opposite of writing novels, wasn't it? It was the way that the reason why you couldn't write novels. So as soon as he got himself out of that, I think he was probably happy to leave it behind. As for Burma, of course, he did write a Burmese novel, and he wrote a lot about Burma in The Road to Wigan Pier. And in my book, Orwell and Empire, which you were kind enough to puff, Les, there is actually a chapter on the police, which discovers that in fact there are police all through Orwell's writing, particularly all through his fiction. There are police in Clergyman's Daughter. There are the police that Gordon Comstock tangles with in the Aspidistra. There are police in Animal Farm, certainly Police in 1984, that's most of the novels looked after. So I think that although he'd sort of worked out his experience of working in the Burma Police in fictional form in Burmese Days and then again in The Road to Wigan Pier, the idea of the police continued to fascinate him. And his whole sort of idea of politics is sort of revolves around the notion of the police. I argued at one stage in that book that in fact you could see with if you just close your eyes slightly, you could see Burmese Days itself as a police procedural. A lot of it is about police business.
Mm. I mean, yeah, rather oddly, one of the straight novels he praised, Landfall by Neville Shute, and you have to read it twice to realise it's actually a detective story, because it's told in such a straightforward way, but it's an interesting one. Teika, it struck me that a lot of Winston's working experience is more similar to Orwell's wife Eileen, who worked for the Ministry of Food and Ministry of Information, than Orwell's own writing for the BBC. Do you think that's why he appeals a more passive figure? Because that female influence, that female anima, is being projected onto him?
I'm not sure, really. I don't know whether he consciously wanted Winston to be more of a passive figure. I mean, I think it's probably you could get a greater contrast of the power of the state if you focus on a character that seems quite passive. So it might have been that where he wanted to make it to really highlight the discrepancy between the powerful state and the individual. So perhaps that's why it was. But I'm not sure I can comment on. Yes, I'm not sure I could comment on the rest of that though.
Okay, that's great. Well, I'd like to thank all three of you, Teika, Douglas, and David. I have two of your books, and I'm going to go out and buy Who is Big Brother. It sounds pretty good. And I'm going to hand back to Quentin, who will open the conversation to the members online now. Thank you very much.
Can you stop sharing your screen, please, Les? Lovely. I can see people. Right. Who would like to ask? Felicia Nimu, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, am I unmuted?
Yes, you are.
Thank you very much. I was very interested in what you had to say, and I'm sure you'll correct me if I misunderstood it, about the characters in 1984 being archetypes. And they may have been, but I also think that they were really very well developed individuals that I could really empathize with. And I think part of this had to do with the fact that they had many little quirks, which are the sorts of things that give people individuality. I won't take up a lot of time by running through all of them, but for example, just with Winston, his thoughts about oranges and lemons, fix this sort of eternity at the heart of the crystal. Interesting observations like that he was gelatinous with fatigue. The term seemed to come spontaneously into his mind. That he endured paralyzing boredom when he signed up for another evening at the center. His reaction toward Tom Parsons, his reaction toward his mother, and of course his overwhelming feelings both in Room 101 and in his last encounter with Julia seemed to me to be an extremely well-developed individual. In fact, the final scene with Julia is, I think, one of the most gripping passages between individuals I've ever seen in fiction. So I'm wondering how you would reply to that I think Winston was really, I know he was supposed to be every man in a sense, but he was also, I felt very deeply into him, and I think that was part of what was so interesting about what Orwell did. While Winston was not supposed to be unusual, he was a very deeply developed character.
I would agree that he was a very well-rounded character, a beautifully drawn character. I was just responding, I suppose, to sometimes people some readers don't respond well to Winston or Julia, and so you do get sometimes people saying that they don't connect with them and they see them as stereotypes. So I would say that they are beautifully drawn, and I suppose that's the craft that just shows the craft of George Orwell, to be able to draw, to be able to create characters that really do connect with huge amounts of readers and are so detailed and have this rich inner life that we can connect to. But in some ways they could be archetypes as well. So that's why I believe they keep resonating. Decades later, they will, I think, keep resonating with us. But there is this argument that I do sometimes hear from readers complaining about them being stereotypes. But I just try not to go down those arguments. So I do completely agree with you, actually. So.
Douglas or David, would you like to add anything?
I suppose I may even have said this before on a George talk, but one of the things I liked about Sandra Newman's Julia novel was that she seemed to flesh out, to give substance to. I mean, I've always found Julia in Orwell's 1984 a slightly detached character who was really there to represent, in some ways, there to represent things rather than to actually, and so to see her given context and ballast and weight, I suppose, was one of the reasons that I liked Sandra Newman's novel, because I think there is I mean, inevitably, there's a sense. I mean, that book is a 1984, took him so long to write, and it's so obviously a book of ideas as well as a book about people. And you can see, all the so many of the essays he was writing in the period 1945 to 7 are then gradually, or perhaps not so gradually, filtered into the succeeding drafts of 1984. So it's a novel that's carrying an awful lot of weight in all kinds of different directions. And I sometimes wonder whether this doesn't have a slight effect on the characterization, but that may be just me.
Thank you both very much. Peter,
Yeah,
good evening or good afternoon or morning, probably where you are.
Thanks. It's been very interesting. But what I dislike most about the Thoreau novel was its depiction of Orwell himself, which Douglas hasn't really commented on, because it seemed to me that Orwell came across as very unattractive, nasty, um, not sympathetically at all. And first of all, of course, I didn't agree with that characterization, and it's what I actually dislike most about the book. I wonder what Douglas feels about that. Thanks.
Thanks, Peter. I don't, well, yes, unattractive, possibly so. But then look at the circumstances and look at what Orwell, think of how Orwell thought of himself as a boy and a young man. He thought he was an unattractive, dreadful, he was a loser, he was small-minded, he was morose, all of these things. So I think Orwell, Thoreau does try to represent that sort of phase of Orwell or Blair in the book. I didn't find that stood between me and an engagement, actually an increasing engagement, I think, with the character. In the early chapters, he doesn't have much to recommend him. But as Thoreau enables you to get to know him a bit better, I found that was, it's proper novel characterization, so it didn't bother me too much.
Okay, thank you. Richard, good evening.
Yes. Hello, David. I enjoyed your book a lot. As always, the writing is very elegant and always eminently readable. Particularly like the chapters on status anxiety and style. And you mentioned the section on pigs. I liked that, but you didn't mention that Eileen signed off her letters with the nickname Pig, I believe.
Did I not put that in? It was certainly something I was certainly something I was
Yeah,
aware
no,
of.
it didn't
I did not.
appear.
Was that not mentioned? Oh well, it's quite a short
No,
book, you see, Richard. It's only
it
70,000 words.
is.
You know,
It is.
you can't pack everything in. No, you're right. But
I
when
think,
it's good of you actually to mention a couple of chapters that I didn't have space for in the discussion with Les, because the chapter I actually enjoyed writing the most in terms of it's telling me what I thought were new things that I
yeah,
had missed about Orwell, was the one about style, because when I went back to the
yeah,
30s novels, I discovered that they are absolutely chock full of animal imagery. And in fact,
yes,
the description of Mr. McKechnie's bookshop, everybody who comes into it is compared to an animal. You know, there's a woman who lumbers in like a bear. There's a man like a squirrel. There's a it's a kind of bestiary, really. I learned lots of things about him in doing that. And I also, you mentioned the chapter about status anxiety. It also, as I combed, and I suppose this reflects the insistence I was stressing earlier about how much more there is to find out about Orwell in the 30s, is that all those 30s novels are, I suppose, in some way a background to, his famous remark in his essay about the dystopian novels that precede 1984, especially a book like a little known novel like Ernest Bramer's The Secret of the League, for example, where Orwell argues, as Gissingen in fact had argued before him, that, the real danger, the real political danger of the right taking over comes from the lower middle classes, because they've got more to lose. They've got their status levels to maintain, and so all of those 430s novels are about people who are terrified of descending further down the social scale, who are marooned at a certain level, and are very jealous of their opportunities and very jealous of what to preserve what little security they are. So in fact, it's very. I'm flattered that you should single out those two chapters, because I think they were the ones in which I myself discovered more about Orwell, which I hadn't previously
right.
thought about. So thank you for that.
On the negative side, I think you underplay the influence of Lawrence on Orwell. I think you underplay the importance of his journalism, journalism as a form of political activism. And surprisingly, you don't mention much his humor, but the one out of all the kind of topics you look at, I'm going to fix on Julia. You've obviously come over the years, David, to the position that she was definitely engaged in a sort of sexploitation honeypot operation. And I looked at your first biography, 2003, and Julia was hardly mentioned. So you've obviously gone through some road to Damascus conversion on this subject. I do disagree with you. I don't think she necessarily was definitely, as it were, a spy engaged in sexploitation. I think Orwell is far more subtle and raises the question, and you rightly mention the bit he cut from his manuscript, which would have placed more emphasis on her possibly being a spy. But I think Orwell cleverly raises the issue and leaves us, as Teika said, Orwell leaves us with questions.
Oh, certainly he leaves us with questions, but I always, increasingly, I think I've always thought, um, and the opinion, which I think is reinforced by Sandra Newman's novel. I've always thought Julie was a bit of a phony and didn't add up. And for me, one of the clinches is where she falls fast asleep when he's reading to her out of the principles of oligarchical collectivism. But there are one or two. It seems to me there are one or two very kind of subtle clues to this, which are perhaps not immediately evident. And it's sometimes since I looked at either the book or 1984, but I have a feeling that. When Julia and Winston first hook up, where the note is dropped and he picks it up in the corridor, it's at exactly the same point in the corridor subsequently that he then comes across O'Brien and gets the nod, which kind of suggests that this is that there's a kind of performative aspect to it, that this is the spot where the plot is being hatched, and that O'Brien is part of the plot, and it's not in any way it's not blatantly brought out, but it seems to me there's just this kind of little flicker here that something is going on, and I agree with you. It is I wouldn't pronounce definitively that that's the case, but it just seems to me that the whole thing has the smell of a put-up job, particularly as we know about Julia's previous career of being involved with high party officials who then have to fall on their swords or spirited away. You know, there is a kind of to me there's a definite air of enticement going on in that. You know, what on earth can she see in him? You know, he's scarcely loves young Dream. Why she picked him out? It's like, you know, it is like a sheep being plucked out of the flock to me by some ulterior intelligence. And I've always, the more I read 1984, the more suspicious I get of Julia and her motives, I'm afraid.
And
Okay,
there's also the reality of Orwell's list, where he was writing about the people he thought were not trustworthy, and some of these people turn out to have been far worse than was realized or even Orwell suspected. That they were Soviet agents, that they were in touch with the embassy, that they were passing secrets. These people
Yes,
were there.
You keep on finding out other connections as well. When I was sort of itemizing the list of the people who attended the wedding breakfast, which of course Orwell himself didn't attend in October 1949. One of the names on that list is Robert Key's business partner, James McKibben, of the firm, the publishing firm of McKibben and Key, which had just started up. Now, James McKibben himself was subsequently revealed to be a Soviet stooge. And can you imagine what Orwell would have thought if he'd have known that one of the people who came to his wedding breakfast was actually a communist spy? I mean, the instance I always adduce on this one is the sad case. In fact, Bernard Crick told me this. Bernard Crick, in the late 1940s, when he was a youngish man, was a friend of the sister of Ian Mikado, the Labour MP. I think it was for Reading in those days, and Miss Mikado, at one point in their friendship, said to Bernard, she said, of course, you know, she said, Mick's got two cards. Which meant, of course, that Ian Mikado, the eminently respectable Labour MP for Reading, was also had a Communist Party membership card. So essentially was taking his orders from Communist Party HQ in King Street. So in some ways, you know, Orwell himself, as we know, said that list was, quote, not very sensational. But in some ways, it was a subsequent, you know, information not then to hand has demonstrated it was all a whole lot worse, as you say, than he deduced at the time.
There was an awful lot not done. On the completely other side, I've just read Tim Tate's book on Hitler's British agents, and that was far worse than was realised, and is only now being detailed and perceived. This was all around agents of totalitarian governments were everywhere on both sides, and in effect were getting away with it. Thank you. Quentin.
Felicity Nemo, you want to come back?
Yes, thank you. Am I unmuted again?
Yes.
Thank you very much. Okay, the question of whether Julia was really a sort of plant, I would like to give some arguments against that and see how you react. You mentioned that one argument in favor of it was that she falls asleep when he's reading from the book. But of course, remember, Julia has told you she's not interested in reading. She's not an intellectual. She's not interested in books. She also falls asleep when he starts talking in general about the way to attack the party in a theoretical way. And I think that's in line with the sort of person she is. You know, books are just, you know, things you produce, like, you know, bootlaces and so forth. About her being involved with high party official, notice that she mentions she's never been involved with the inner party, not with those swine. Not with those swine, no, but there's plenty that would if they got half a chance. And the question of why Julia picks Winston out, she says it's something in the face. You really never have much else to go by. And given that Winston, in fact, is secretly rebellious and is worried about the ability to control his face, it would hardly be surprising that he gave something away. I think the main reason, though, I'm inclined to react against this is that it makes the book less exciting. I mean, Orwell was a great writer, and part of being great is having two people who rebel in really different ways, an intellectual way and a sort of instinctive way. So while I don't regard it as entirely conclusive, I would say there's a strong case against it, and I'm curious how you would reply to that.
Well, I think what you've just the evidence that you've just presented to me is conclusive that it's possible to read the book in two different ways. In the same way, and in some ways, this is an argument about, in some ways, being too involved, too imbricated in your Orwell. In fact, to go back to what Douglas was saying about Burma Sahib, which I found very interesting as I'd read and reviewed the book myself when it came out, having been certainly an enormous fan of Paul Theroux's early novels, while not perhaps liking the later ones so much. But the thing about, to me, about reading Burma Sahib is that if you know your Orwell, like it or not, you're immediately going to be suspicious. And so the criticisms that I had of Burma Sahib are not perhaps, I mean, Douglas comes to it, from the angle of someone who know, imperial studies and the politics of the East and Orwell's imbrication in them. My angle, I suppose, as well as being an Orwell fan on Burma Sahib, my angle is that of the novel reader and the literary critic who comes to a text to see how it works. When I come to Burma Sahib, because I know my Orwell and because I know my Burmese days, I immediately find it stagey. And I can't help that. I'm thinking to myself, oh, this is going to happen now. Or he's going to use that incident, isn't he, in the next chapter because he has to, because this is Orwell. Now, I can't help that. I'm probably overeducated in Orwell. And I think the problem with me when I read 1984 for the umpteenth time, is although in some ways I don't know enough, we none of us know enough about these books. I think that's, that's one of the great things about them. There are always new things to find out. As I was saying to Richard Keeble earlier, the great thing about rereading those 30s novels is you find out more stuff that you haven't noticed. And in one way, I'm conscious of the fact that I know too much about 1984. And in another way, I'm conscious that I don't know enough. So this is why I start being suspicious of Julia. And this is why, the evidence that you adduce for Julia's comparative innocence is my evidence for her blameworthiness. And it's just a question of your perspective and where you're coming from. So I don't think that we're ever going to have an answer to this, which perhaps is the great thing. This is the thing about these great texts. They're elusive, they're protean. You can't pin them down. So I accept everything you say while still being chary of it, I suppose.
And the great man here isn't here to adjudicate.
Quentin, in our audience, we've got Sylvia Topp, the author
Yes.
of Eileen, The Making of George Orwell, the great biography. Sylvia, will you answer a question, please? She's
unmuting.
She's just unmuting.
Hi, Sylvia.
Hello. My question is, what do you think of my thought that Eileen's experience working in the Ministry of Information and the Ministry of Food possibly influenced Orwell's descriptions of Winston working in the Ministry of Truth?
Oh, I agree completely. Yeah. Because he wouldn't have that experience, and she was a big talker, so she would be coming back all the time to tell him what she was finding out there. And unfortunately, they don't save each other's letters, so we don't really know what went back and forth between them. But every time I'm working on a collection of her letters, and she is so observant of everything. So she would definitely be talking to him all the time, I would think.
And then it's a question of how he uses the information he's given, which is what he also did with his friend, the insurance agent, who provided the information which got turned into George Bowling's career in Coming Up for Air. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.
Are there any other questions? Or
Could I just say something in
please,
response
yes,
to David Taylor? Because David just made an excellent argument that people who know a lot about Orwell should not be the people who are consulted about his books. As for Burma Sahib being stagey, I think I did also get the feeling that, particularly towards the end of the novel, he was kind of shoveling everything in from Burmese days, that he's got sort of material that he needs to use, and it all goes in a somewhat artificial way. So in a sense, I'm partially agreeing with you, I think.
The other, if I could just make one more point about that, is that, and this is not an adverse criticism, it's not a complaint, but I know because I've I've seen I remember him writing a jacket puff for it. But Theroux is a big friend of Geoffrey Meyer's, previous Orwell biographer,
Yeah.
and I think pretty much follows his line in terms of interpretations of Orwell's career, which is a perfectly reasonable thing to do. But I did just sort of notice it. There is a certain amount, I think, of stage management, and to an extent, the stage management comes from the biographical authorities that he's following. I don't produce this as an adverse criticism. But I think it's something that does rather declare itself from reading the novel. I don't know what you think about that, Douglas.
I hadn't thought about that, but I think that's a very interesting observation. And I have to go back and read it again.
Again, you see, and you'll know too much about it. Is it possible for me to ask Sylvia a question? It's great to see you, Sylvia. When can we
Yeah.
expect these letters?
What was your question?
When can we expect your edition of Eileen's letters?
Oh, I think it's October maybe.
Fantastic. Another book for 2025.
Yeah, it's 9 chapters, and we're getting over 20 letters of hers. So I'm annotating them all, so you can all complain about my
Oh,
interpretation.
we better book you for another George.
Book her in, quick.
Can you put yourself down for May next year, which is the next available slot?
It's so much fun to do. Yeah, we're really enjoying it. We're at chapter 9. We're in the last chapter now, so we're getting there.
Yeah, I mean you're collaborating with Angela Smith, the
With Angela Smith.
professor at Sunderland.
She's actually writing the script for the most part, the text for the most part, and I'm adding the letters and checking them against Peter Davison's book to make sure that the way he interprets them anyway, his footnotes and everything I'm using, as well as my own insights.
That's excellent. Thanks for asking the question, David. Felicia, Nemo, and Richard again, and then I think we should thank our speakers and go and have some fortification.
Okay, thank you. 2 things. One, I was told I was down for May next year. I got a message from you saying that.
I must check my records then.
I can send it back to you. It said the next available date was May, and that I was being.
No, that's right. You've got it. That was in my head when I was thinking what was next.
Okay, thanks. But the other thing, which I think is more important, is this. Here's what I think is an even better argument, not conclusive, but strong, against the idea of Julia being a plant. At the end, O'Brien is no longer deceiving Winston. He has no reason to, because he wants Winston to accept it, welcome it, become part of it. It's true that there's something he withholds, whether there was ever a brotherhood. But remember, he wants to, we will squeeze you empty and then fill you with ourselves. How could he do that? Even how much better he could do that if he could say Julia was just a plant, so Winston would know there had never been any alternative. So basically my point is O'Brien has no motive, if it's going to be the case that Julia was just a plant, not to use that to gloat over Winston.
Good point.
So what do you think of that?
Good point.
Very good, Richard.
Right. Going back to Eileen, and I'm sure Sylvia may want to just confirm what I'm saying, but David, I think you may have underplayed her importance in that period of Orwell, just before the war, when he was distinctly pacifist. And Sylvia has discovered that the membership ticket for the Peace Pledge Union was not E.B. Eric Blair, but it was Eileen Blair. And Eileen's pacifism, I think, probably influenced him enormously in that period leading up to the Second World War. Obviously, it changed with the outbreak, blah, but I think we need to stress Eileen's influence on his pacifist period. Would you agree, Sylvia?
Oh, yes, definitely. Yeah.
Christian email, I'll have you down for April.
Oh, then I must have misunderstood you, but April is fine with me. Thank you.
April the 6th, because of where Easter falls. So it's
Sorry, my error, perhaps.
not at all. Whoever it is, that's what I've got you down for. Well, this has been a very stimulating evening. I'm sure you've all enjoyed it. Please can we thank Les and our guests, Douglas, David, and of course, Teika, getting it right.